Hi there everyone. This is a very special product review video because we are going to be taking a look at this. This is the new DJI O3 Air unit, and it is DJI's second generation digital FPV system. Now, if you're anything like me, you are going to be super excited to hear about all the new features, the specs, and the performance that DJI has been able to bring with this new hardware. And we are going to be covering all of that in this video. But this video is primarily going to be a product shootout, and we are going to see how this new DJI O3 system compares to WalkSnail's Avatar system, HDZero's digital FPV system, and of course the DJI V1 FPV system. We're going to be looking at image quality, both onboard recording and in goggle DVR, and we're going to be testing the latency of all of these systems as well. Whether you're new to FPV or very experienced in digital FPV already, by the end of this video, I hope that you're going to have all of the data and analysis that you need to know which of these systems is going to be right for you. So let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into it. Before I take you through the image quality and latency comparison, I wanted to show you the new DJI O3 Air unit on the bench. And we'll start with the antenna. It's very similar to the Calyx Vista antenna in its design, but it's a diversity system, as you can see here. So we have two antenna UFL connectors, and they both go into this same physical antenna. So we should see some of the same benefits that you get with the original DJI Air unit in terms of diversity transmission, having those two elements, but there's no spatial diversity because they both go into the same physical antenna. If we look at the Air unit itself now, you can see that it's slightly smaller than the original DJI Air unit, and actually a very similar size to the Calyx Vista, maybe ever so slightly bigger. But realistically, you're going to be able to fit this new DJI O3 Air unit into any quad that currently accepts a Calyx Vista, with the caveat that there is no mounting points on this new Air unit. You can see that it's just a plain box with no screw holes. So when you're mounting it into the quad, you're either going to have to use a 3D print, which could make it quite a bit bigger, or you could use some double-sided, very high bond strength tape. I'll put a link to something suitable down in the video description for that. The Air unit is this plain black box. It's all aluminium housing, and it has slots machined into it to improve cooling. And that's quite important because this new Air unit does consume quite a bit more power and generate a bit more heat than the original Air unit or the Calyx Vista. In terms of what you've got on the outside of the Air unit, there's an SD card slot which allows you to expand the storage for internal recording. So the Air unit has 20 gigabytes of onboard storage, but when you're recording in 4K at 50 or 60 frames per second, which is what this unit can do, you might need to expand that out to extend your recording time, and so there's an SD card slot for that. A USB-C port for firmware updates and activating the unit, just like the original Air unit. And on the other side, you've got the bind button and a status LED as well. All in all, it's very, very similar to the original DJI Air unit, obviously with the added features of image stabilization and recording up to 4K 60 frames per second. The connector for this new Air unit is very similar to the connector for the original Air unit or the Calyx Vista. We've got power, ground, a UART, which does now support full Betaflight OSD canvas mode, and an S-bus and signal ground for your remote control. The remote controller for this new DJI O3 Air unit is the DJI FPV Remote Controller 2. And the Air unit itself will pair with either the DJI Goggles V2 or the new DJI Goggles 2 with the OLED screens. Now let's take a look at the camera, and I think this is where DJI has made some of the biggest changes compared to the original Air unit. You can see that the camera has a much larger plate glass lens than the original DJI camera, and behind that lens is a larger 1/1.7 inch sensor, which promises much better image quality. And we'll take a look at that in the image quality comparison a little later in the video. The mounting pattern for the camera is the same as the original DJI camera, but it's important to be aware that the mounting position and where the lens ends up is very different on this new camera. The new camera lens is much further back than the old camera lens, and the result is that if you use it in the same mounting as the original DJI FPV camera, you do need to be careful that you're not going to see the camera plate in the side of the camera image. I will be updating all of my AOS frames with camera plates designed for this O3 system, and I'll put some links down in the video description so you can check those out if you're interested. Another important consideration when choosing a frame for this O3 system is vibration and resonance. And you want to make sure that there is no resonance or vibration getting to that IMU. Otherwise, it's going to significantly affect your image stabilization performance. This may be another area where the vibration and resonance performance of AOS frames can offer some benefit for you. The Air unit is able to run on up to 6S voltage, so the same as the Calyx Vista. And now let's look at it side by side with a few other digital FPV systems as well. So you can see that the size of the Air unit in terms of its plan area is very similar to all of these other systems, but this new Air unit is slightly thicker than the Avatar or HDZero, and pretty much identical to the Calyx Vista. So now that we've taken a look at all of these systems side by side on the bench, let's power them up and take a look at the image quality side by side. So let's look at the image quality for these systems. And to start with, we're looking at footage from onboard recording for all the systems that supports it. So that means the HDZero system is using goggle DVR for this test. All of the onboard recording was set to 1080p 60 frames per second, and then I've tiled it up to 4K to preserve all of the pixels. I'm not going to tell you which system is which right away. I want you to just absorb these images and decide for yourself which of these systems is doing the best job to produce an image that you would like to fly to. I know that personally, I like my FPV systems to have lots of shadow detail and lots of fidelity in branches and leaves, because that really helps me when I'm diving into tight spaces to see where to go. But you might be different, so have a look at these images and decide which one looks best for you. Now I've zoomed all of these recordings in to 2 times, and this is the opportunity to see the detail that each of these systems is able to capture. The DJI O3 Air unit has a really large 1/1.7 inch sensor, which should give it an advantage in capturing really fine detail in the image. So have a look at these images and see if you can guess which one is the O3 Air unit and which of the systems is capturing the most detail in that foliage. Now I've switched to the in-goggle DVR footage from all the systems. So the images that you're seeing now are still zoomed in, but they've now been transmitted to the goggles. So you can see if there's been any loss of clarity, any loss of detail in all of these images. This is the image that you would be seeing if you were looking into the goggles. So have a look at the detail in the branches and the leaves and decide which system is doing best. Now I'll zoom the goggle DVR back out to 1 times, and I'll also put up which system is which. Let me know down in the comments if you were able to correctly identify the O3 system and which of the systems you prefer from an image quality perspective for daytime flying. Can you see the advantage of the larger 1/1.7 inch sensor on the O3 system? Let's make things a little tougher on the systems now. This is just after sunset when the light level is much lower. You can see that the systems deal with this lower light level quite differently. Again, have a look at the images and see which of the systems you think is performing better or worse in this lower light level environment. The final test is nighttime. So this is completely after dark, it's pitch black outside, and we'll see how the systems are able to do with a very low light level. The DJI system is using the original DJI camera. The Calyx Polar is known to have better low light performance. The HDZero system is using the HDZero camera from RunCam, and the Walk Snail Avatar system is using the 19mm camera. The O3 system from DJI is using its camera. Alright, so now you've had the chance to look at all of the systems side by side, let me give you my analysis and opinion on how they compare. Now please bear in mind I am not a video expert by any means. But let's start with the HDZero system. Now I think the HDZero system delivered the least detail out of all of the systems, but it handled the low light conditions the best, and it was really able to bring out a lot of detail and contrast in the twilight and nighttime clips, much more so than any of the other systems. So we have to commend HDZero for that. Then I think it's a dead heat between the DJI V1 system and the WalkSnail Avatar system. I think that now with the latest updates from the Avatar system, they are really close in terms of detail. The WalkSnail system is a slightly softer image, whereas the DJI V1 system is a slightly more sharpened image. But they deliver very similar levels of detail, perhaps with the WalkSnail Avatar system now just starting to pull ahead and delivering slightly more detail in some of the foliage and the tree line compared to the DJI V1 system. But when it comes to low light performance, I think DJI V1 is still outperforming the WalkSnail Avatar system. It's able to bring out more detail in that low light situation. Another thing to mention is that the DJI V1 system does a really good job of delivering detail in the shadows compared to the Avatar system. Now this may be a case of tuning the exposure. All of the clips were shot on the default exposure settings. So adjusting the exposure on the camera for the Avatar system might help to bring out a bit more detail in the shadows, but that's not how it looks by default. And then we come on to the O3 system, and I think that the DJI O3 system is delivering far and away more detail than any of the other systems on test. Now, how is it able to do that? Well, it's a higher resolution feed. From DJI V1 at 720p, the O3 system increases that to 1080p. So you've got a full HD link now. The bitrate is the same at 50 megabits per second, but they have changed the encoding from H.264 to H.265. And that change of encoding allows them to get more detail, more perceived image quality into the same bitrate. And that's the main advantage of H.265 compared to H.264, is better image quality at lower bit rates. In terms of low light performance, I think the O3 system still lags a little bit behind the DJI V1 system and actually the HDZero system in terms of how it's able to handle those low light conditions. And I would hope that they might be able to improve that with software, because the large sensor on the DJI O3 system should allow it to perform well in low light, all else being equal. So maybe there's something they can do in software there. We'll have to see. The next thing that I want to talk about is the latency of the systems. And this is a really critical parameter for racing or for fast freestyle flying, where you really want the minimum delay between what the camera sees on the drone and what you see in the goggles to help you avoid those obstacles and fly really fast and precisely in close proximity to things. Now, to test that, I have set all of these systems up with my 1000 frames per second camera, and so we're going to have a look at the side-by-side comparison of that now. Now let's look at the side-by-side latency comparison. Now for this, I have two LEDs wired in parallel, one LED in the goggles in view of the high-speed camera, and one LED in front of the camera on the drone. So at 0, both LEDs turn on. You can see the LEDs turn on in the high speed. Now we wait for the LED to turn on from the camera. We can see that the HDZero system comes in first, followed by the DJI V1 system and the WalkSnail Avatar system immediately after, and then the O3 system is the slowest. An important thing to know about the DJI O3 system is that the latency of video to the goggles depends a lot on the internal recording setting in the drone. So here we have a comparison of the 100 frames per second internal recording compared to the 60 and 50 frames per second internal recording. And you can see that there is quite a bit of difference in the latency, with the 60 and 50 frames per second modes taking significantly longer for the image to reach the screen of the goggles. If we carefully count the frames in the high-speed footage, and knowing that at 1000 frames per second each frame is 1 millisecond, we can easily calculate the latency of all of the systems on test. Now I'm going to report two latencies. The first is the time to the first bright pixel, which is the pipeline latency of the system, and then the time to the first bright frame. So that's the time it takes to fully update a new frame with all the new information. So we can see that HDZero is the fastest in terms of the time to the first bright pixel, and very fast time to first bright frame as well, just over 30 milliseconds. The DJI and WalkSnail Avatar systems, DJI V1 and WalkSnail Avatar, are very, very similar. They both have similar pipeline latency and a similar time to the first bright frame as well. Now, if we come over to look at the DJI O3 system, we can see that the time to the first bright pixel, or pipeline latency, is a little bit longer than for the WalkSnail Avatar and DJI V1 systems at about 30 milliseconds. And this is likely due to the extra computation that they need to do to encode that extra detail into the link. Then at 100 frames per second, we have a time to the first bright frame of 40 milliseconds. However, if you want to use the onboard recording options for 4K, you're going to be running at 60 or 50 frames per second, where the latency is significantly increased. We can see that the pipeline latency is just about 50 milliseconds for both of these frame rate settings, and that the time to the first bright frame is even longer, and it takes more than 60 milliseconds to complete that first bright frame. Now that we've looked at the data, let me give you my analysis and opinion on this latency testing. Clearly, with the O3 system, DJI has chosen to prioritize the image quality and resolution of the link over latency. And we can see that that's meant that even at 100 frames per second, the latency is not quite as fast as the DJI V1 system. And that's to be expected when you have so many more pixels to push and you're trying to encode so much more detail. There has to be a trade-off somewhere, and that trade-off is in computation and encoding time. Another feature that's really important to highlight is this codependency between the recording rate on the drone and the latency of the link to the goggles. The highest resolution recording settings of 4K are only available at the lower frame rates, which means that if you want to run 100 frames per second all the time for the fastest possible link, you are going to be limited to recording either in 1080p or 2.7K. And at those higher frame rates, you're not going to achieve the same kind of motion blur that you will be able to achieve with a lower frame rate. So this is a trade-off that you have to make with the O3 system when you're deciding what settings you want to run, whether you want the highest possible frame rate for the lowest possible latency, or whether you want to run higher resolutions and lower frame rates for a little more motion blur. And that brings us really nicely onto the onboard recording of the system, which is a feature that DJI is really keen to emphasize. The O3 system brings 4K onboard recording at up to 60 frames per second with image stabilization through Rocksteady. And so I'm going to show you some footage now of the onboard recording from the system, both with image stabilization on and image stabilization off as well. So here is some onboard recording, 4K, 60 frames per second, and this is unstabilized. And I'm flying with the DJI Remote Controller 2, and I'm having to fly it with thumbs, and I really don't fly with thumbs. I'm always a pinch grip, which means that I'm actually really struggling here to fly nice and smoothly. So if you do see some little jerks from the quad, that is just my inexperience flying with thumbs and just not having the control that I'm used to. There's one there. But overall, I think that the footage out of the O3 system is really, really good. The quality is exceptional, and it's certainly much higher than the onboard recording quality that you could get with the V1 Air unit, or really with any other FPV system. You can really see how the trade-offs that DJI has made in terms of the latency of the system have been able to pay dividends in the quality of the onboard recording that they're able to achieve. And this is all unstabilized. So now I'm going to switch to some footage that has been stabilized with Rocksteady. So here we have some footage that has been stabilized using the image stabilization on the O3 Air unit. So this is with Rocksteady on. And you can see that, this footage is really exceptionally smooth. And certainly the little shakes that were being caused by my inexperience with flying with thumbs earlier are being better eliminated with Rocksteady on than Rocksteady off. And this is also a later flight where I've gotten a little bit more used to flying with thumbs, and so I've been able to be a little bit smoother. You will still see the occasional little twitch and jerk as I under and overcorrect, as I'm just getting used to flying in this new way. But the quality of the image is still really, really high. The detail is there, and I think that overall the picture is really nicely exposed. Excellent for a GoPro type action shot. What I will say is that this really vibrant, contrasty image is really wonderful to look at for someone who's enjoying the footage after the fact. But having these slightly darker shadows can make it a little bit more difficult to dive into tight spaces, and takes a little away from the confidence that you might have when flying. And that's also a compromise that has to be made, because you can't have a really contrasty, vibrant image and still have plenty of light and detail in those dark, shadowy areas. You end up with an image that looks much flatter and it's less interesting. But yes, certainly the onboard recording of the system is a real highlight of this new O3 Air unit. And flying like this is really showing it off to its strengths. If this video has helped you decide that the O3 system is right for your next build, there are links down in the video description to where you can order yours today. And they are affiliate links, which means if you click that link and buy anything from the affiliated vendor, I get a small commission at no cost to you, and it helps support the channel and more videos like this. So if you're planning a purchase, I'd really appreciate it if you'd use one of those links. I know that when you see onboard recorded footage of that quality, the natural question to ask is, how does it compare to a dedicated action camera like a GoPro Hero, or maybe a slightly cheaper action camera like a Runcam 5? Well, I'm afraid that's not a comparison that I'm able to bring you in this video, but please make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because I will be publishing a second video with a detailed comparison between the O3 Air unit and a GoPro Hero 9 and a Runcam 5 very, very soon on my channel. It'll go live just a few hours or maybe a day after this video. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one when it comes out. And that brings us to the conclusions section of this video, where I give you my thoughts on the O3 system so far, and also try and talk you through who I think this system is right for. When we're talking about DJI, they are a tremendously resourceful and capable company. They have the money and the engineering capability to make the product that they want to make. So we have to ask, what product did they make here, and who does it serve best? The O3 system clearly prioritizes above all else onboard recording quality. They have the 4K resolution, the large image sensor, and the electronic image stabilization. And it also prioritizes the image quality of the feed to the goggles. So you get the maximum resolution and fidelity of image that it's possible to give you in the goggles when you're flying the drone. But DJI have had to make some trade-offs to achieve that high level of image quality, and the main one is latency. The O3 system is significantly slower than the DJI V1 system and other digital FPV systems like the Walksnail Avatar and HDZero system. And that latency gets even slower if you're not running at 100 frames per second, which if you're looking to record at 4K, you won't be. You're going to be running at 60 or 50 frames per second, where the latency is significantly higher. The type of image that the O3 camera produces is also better suited to onboard recording. It's a very vibrant, contrasty image with dark shadows and bright highlights that looks fantastic, but it doesn't give you as much detail in the shadows to see as you're diving into dark spaces compared to something like the DJI V1 system, which has a much more muted, flatter image, but you do get more detail in the shadows to give you that confidence when you're diving into dark spaces. And that's another trade-off that has to be made in order to prioritize the quality of that onboard recording. So who is the O3 system right for? Well, I think if you're a pilot who likes to fly a slower, more cruisy style, really likes to use drones to enjoy the environment without flying fast or in close proximity to objects, or trying to do very aggressive moves and tricks, then the O3 system could be a really good solution for you. You're going to get the best possible visual experience of flying that you can possibly achieve with any FPV system that's available today, and you're probably not going to be so sensitive to the latency of the link. If, however, you are a very aggressive racing or freestyle pilot who wants to capture really dynamic and exciting aerial footage for YouTube or something like that, where you are going to be flying fast, you are going to be flying in close proximity to objects, you are going to be wanting to do aggressive and difficult tricks where you need the lowest possible latency of your FPV feed, then I don't think the O3 system is really going to suit you very well. You're going to be wanting to record in the highest possible quality, so you're going to be running at 60 or 50 frames per second, and the latency of the link is going to be noticeable at that point. So that's going to make it more difficult to do those aggressive moves, and you are probably better off with a dedicated FPV system and a dedicated onboard recording system with very, very different settings. You know, your FPV system is going to have a pretty flat color profile, lots of detail in the shadows, very high frame rate, very low latency. And your onboard recording system is going to have very high resolution, really vivid colors, and probably be running at a lower frame rate to bring out more motion blur to increase the excitement of the footage that you're capturing. Whether you're looking for the highest image quality in the goggles and excellent onboard recording of the O3 system, or you're looking for a lower latency digital FPV system to support more aggressive freestyle flying, the conclusion that I'm drawing from this testing is that there really has never been a better time to get into digital FPV. We have 4 systems now, all of which have different specs, different performance, and support a different kind of flying. So there's going to be a system that's right for you no matter what type of flying you like to do, and it's just a case of deciding which system suits your style of flying best. I hope that you enjoyed this video. As you can probably imagine, it takes quite a bit of time to put together this type of scientific side-by-side comparison of all of these systems, and I wouldn't be able to do it without the generous support of all my patrons. If you'd like to support more work like this, then please consider joining my Patreon. You can join from just a few dollars a month, and it'll give you access to a special area on my Discord server, as well as sneak peeks of the projects that I'm working on. If a subscription isn't something that you're able to do right now, but you would still like to chuck a couple of bucks my way as a thanks for this video, then I also have a Buy Me a Coffee, and there's a link to both of those down in the video description. That's all that I have for today, so until next time, I wish you all very, very happy flying.